Okay, welcome everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to moderate our first session as well as welcome you to our Cloud Migration 101, How to Goof-Proof Your Cloud Journey Summit, brought to you by CoreView, 1111 Systems, and EG Innovations. Before we start today's three-session event, we do have some announcements. First, we wanted to let you know this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. And each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you by our experts. Also, during today's third session, we will be giving away a GoPro Hero 10. But you must be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from our sponsors, CoreView, 1111 Systems, and EG Innovations, available on the console right now, so please download and check those out. It's because of our sponsors underwriting this content that we can bring you this summit. So we thank them for sponsoring the summit and supporting the community and ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events in the future. Now on to the first session of today's summit, Top 10 Do's and Don'ts of Cloud Migration Planning. This session features Karen Lopez. Karen has 20+ years of experience in project and data management on large multi-project programs and specializes in the general application of data management principles. She's a frequent speaker, blogger, and panelist on data quality, data governance, logical and physical modeling, data compliance, development methodologies, and social issues in computing. Karen, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Thanks so much, David. Hey, David, when you go to do the draw for the GoPro, just pick my name. I'd really appreciate that. And, and as David said, I'm all about the data and everything. And I just wanted to throw a shout out there. You can see an icon on my slide. I'm a NASA Datanaut, and that means I volunteer to help NASA and usually a dozen or so other space agencies from around the world run their Space Apps Challenge Hackathon. And so if you want to contact me after to find out how you can win a NASA hackathon, I'd be happy to chat with you. The other thing is he talked about, please at any time get your questions in there in the Q&A. We even like if you raise some issues, want to leave kudos, want to disagree. I'm all for that. I think the best presentations are more engaging and have a lot of conversation with the people attending. So please do that. So we're going to start off right away. And every list related thing has to have a big slide number on there. So I think oh, and by the way, I want to say, I could spend 2 hours covering all the advice I have about migrating and doing cloud migrations in both directions, by the way. But I'm going to start at the beginning. I think it's so important before you begin a migration project or even decide what your migration project should be, is that you inventory your current systems and data. And by data here, I mean both databases, I mean flat files, I mean images, I mean voice recordings, I mean everything that is data. And the reason you want to do that is you don't want to find mid-migration that you cannot find the data that you thought you had. Or a more common situation is some people believe that this system is the source of data, the single version of the truth, or the the golden records for certain data, only to find out later that the system you're migrating actually gets that data from someplace else, and it may be beneficial to migrate directly rather than going between system and system and system. There's always a risk as you make a copy of data. We all know that. And then you end up making copies of copies, and people apply transformations incorrectly, or they misunderstand them, or they don't realize that one simple import actually does a tiny transformation. So it's really good idea to make sure that you have a good inventory. So in 2024, one of the ways we do that, and what's becoming hot again, is a data catalog or a system catalog or a system repository to hold this information about this inventory. Now, I'm not really talking about GitHub for code, but a repository that has a list of the data and the sources and the systems and all the metadata about those systems. Yes, a lot of those things might be in other repositories, but modern repositories might just link out to other repositories. And in order to make these data catalogs and system repositories work well, you have to have decent data governance to help curate those list of things, help explain them, help identify, yes, we have this data set and it's over here, but it's over here for this one system that we couldn't integrate with something else. So it's really important, if you don't have this work already done, realize that there are costs and risks to not having a good inventory of your systems. The other thing that we forget about as we're going from totally on-prem to cloud solutions is that the cost models are significantly different in important ways. And one of the ways is data ingress, bringing data in, and data egress. When all of our data is on-prem, there's not an additional cost for reading data or pulling data out of systems. However, in the cloud, typically ingress is free. They want you to put your data in the cloud, but egress is expensive, bringing it back on-prem. Or what some people mess up is moving data in the cloud from one region to another cloud region. Those are typically paid data movements and count as egress, even though it's all staying in the cloud. I know when I first started working with cloud providers, I kept forgetting about that extra cost that can pile up to be a significant cost, as well as extra risk by moving data around between systems. Together with the fact that, as you all know, our data volumes are just growing and growing and growing. And I got used to not having to budget during my projects, during my development or support projects for the volume of data. And that's only because in the past, those were capitalized storage costs. But in today's world, where you pay for every bit, whether it's sitting on a drive, whether it's sitting in a database, you're paying for volume, you're paying for moving data, and that requires different architectural decisions. It's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just a different cost model. So the other thing that's going to happen is if you architect everything the same way you've always known it to be on premises, you might end up building something that will technically work, meaning it will move data, it'll answer your questions, it'll make beautiful dashboards, it'll generate beautiful reports, it'll fire off transactions, but it could be much more expensive and also much more fragile. So I find that data architects and storage architects need to work together to think about these new cost models, the new risks, and even the new benefits, because it's different, not necessarily, better or worse, but different. What I want to make sure you do is you choose your migration sequences properly. So here's a thing that happened to me once at a client, is that they wanted to move their payroll system to the cloud. That's where they had established the biggest bang for the buck was going to be, that they were going to get, all these benefits by moving their payroll system to the cloud instead of running it on-prem. But what they didn't account for is typically payroll systems are at the end of this very long line of processes. And all of those processes were needed to feed into payroll. And while typically looking at things application by application, which is how we used to think about making cost, benefit, and risk decisions, isn't really the same in the cloud, because this was going to have data moving in and out, moving in and out on its way into the payroll to calculate payroll. And therefore, they weren't going to get as many benefits as they had perceived, because instead of moving what I call the transactional or the original data or the master data up there, they had moved the last process, and they ended not getting all the benefits, and they ended up increasing their costs because they migrated what they felt was going to be the best system to migrate first. And it still worked. It was still a great solution. But what they ended up with was extra costs. And there was a risk that future cloud migrations weren't going to happen. The other thing is with payroll systems, they were worried much more about fraud and security and compliance than, say, let's take a part of the overall payroll system and let's just talk timekeeping and time records and billing records. Those things still need to be secured, still very data driven, still very transactional. But other than someone changing someone's timesheet, it didn't involve checks or banks or direct deposits or any of those things. And that the other, like I mentioned in the previous slide, this whole looking at the whole process, the whole business process, all the systems, to decide what's the right chunk to sort of bring to the cloud based on the total cost of ownership. I think that's really important. Of course, you need to plan for data migration. I thought this was kind of a throwaway, but also the things like not just the volume of data, because I hinted at persisting data in the cloud, that costs you. Every byte that's sitting in the cloud costs you. And yes, storage can be cheaper in the cloud, often much cheaper than what you store on-prem. If you're storing lots of volume and then moving that volume around to different systems that use it, which is typically what we might do on-prem, that's going to cost you more. Also, the rate of data lifecycle, like, is this data constantly being updated, or is it more like a log, like a timesheet? These are going to impact your plans, and especially impact your cost models. The last one, I love this because I work with people who are new to the cloud, and they're saying things like, I need to move data from Singapore to Sao Paulo, and it's really slow latency. How do I fix this? Do I need to put more indexes on my database? Do I need better compression? And you take a look at their system and you find out, no, there's not much you can do, because the Earth operates under the law of physics that literally moving light from one side of the Earth to the other side of the Earth can be quite expensive. So one of my teams got me a t-shirt that said, you can't bend the rule of physics no matter what a great optimizer you are, or something like that. And I think we sometimes forget just how much distance and the width of your pipes. The other thing that happens here is, of course, you don't want to over provision in the cloud. That's another mistake that teams make. By over provisioning, I mean architecting like we were on-prem. So 2 decades ago, if we wanted to build a whole human resources system, and we had payroll and we had timekeeping and we had jobs and org charts, we would need to do a fairly large capacity planning exercise to figure out, what size servers do we need? What failovers do we want? How much storage? How fast should the storage be? Where should the storage be? And do we need to replicate the data across all of our regional offices so that they have better performance? Or can they operate when the internet's down? Like, all of those questions we did. So we had to not just provision what we need, but what we would need, 2, 3, 5, sometimes even more years into the future. because we pretty much want to get it right and have capacity to grow. Well, you don't want to do that in the cloud because you'll be very much overpaying for future growth, because the cloud architecture method is to be able to scale out or scale up depending on, what services you're using in the cloud. And I find that traditional on-site architects, which are sometimes developers wearing an architecture hat, like I'll admit that too, is that you want to over provision all the time, but you really need to think about provisioning enough and provisioning, automatic scale up or automatic scale out, even being able to provision services that you can turn off. For instance, if it's a regular job that's run monthly, you probably shouldn't be paying for cloud services to hang around waiting for another job to run in a few weeks. This is what I call the whole physics problem of changing how your brain thinks about architecting in the cloud, working in the cloud. And it really varies based on the type of service you're using. So we architect differently for database as a service than we do a database system running in a VM. So in that case, we're provisioning a virtual machine. We are managing the operating system there, the file system there, the security system on the VM. It's basically on-prem, but in the cloud. So instead of a data center down the road, it's a data center that might be hundreds of miles down the road. But that's very similar. However, if you were going to go to Amazon RDS or Azure SQL DB or any of these other databases as a service, you're going to provision those things differently so that if you have increased demand or larger workloads, or say, you have a data story that has regular transactional updates, think like a point of sale system where people are just buying things versus you're doing a lot of acquisitions. So let's say you're a software as a service provider and you're adding in whole new clients on a regular basis. And so instead of your database as a service having a growth pattern of growing by 5% of customers every year or 10% of transactions every year, your growth pattern is going to be something more like add 100,000 new customers in the customer table every few weeks. So it's really important to understand that I call it cloud math. It's still the same math as on-prem and everything, but doing cloud math is just different because you have a greater variety of how things can change, as well as they could also decrease suddenly. For instance, you're a software as a service customer and you've lost customers, tenants that are running things there. So this is a very similar thing, optimize for scalability. So in scalability,
Hey, Karen,
yeah.
before you get to that point, we have a question coming in from Paul about your last point.
Okay.
Paul in the audience asks, for companies without the teams and other resources to granularly plan a cloud migration, is there an AI or automation assisted, accelerated approach to plan and coordinate a migration?
Wow. So I was saving the AI stuff till later, but I'm happy to. I didn't want to start with AI. No, I didn't want to start with AI because it seems every presentation in June of 2024 starts with AI. But that's a great question. So I'm not sure AI would plan all your migration, but I am a huge fan of AI assistance within IT systems, within data systems. So some of the things that AI could do to help are things like profiling your data, like actually watching your transactions, help you do predictive analytics. Like we've always done predictive analytics using our analytics tools within IT, but using AI assisted that has learned from how your systems have run for the last few years, it's definitely going to be something that we could take advantage of. The other things is I am predicting, I don't have any knowledge of this, that there will be some automated, I don't know what to call them. Like, I want to say run books. So, not quite code, not quite the run books that we use in DevOps, where it's also code and some configuration, but AI that will assist you and walk you through the plans. Like, for instance, that would start asking you questions. Okay, you're migrating this particular application, which uses these databases, this code, these scripts, it uses this monitoring system, and you would feed all that in. And you might say, if I were migrating to Microsoft Azure, what do's and don'ts might I have to look at when I do this? Like, it might help me do costs, it might help me do risk assessments. It might say, hey, I see this system also manages email notifications to customers. Have you considered these GDPR, or these privacies, or these anti-spam things to consider? It doesn't look like the emails you're sending out have, meet all the laws for this jurisdiction. So I'm not sure if that's the exact question, but I'm totally looking forward to this, because I have this saying, the best, and I'll say data architect because that's what I consider myself as, the best data architect is a lazy data architect. I want to leverage AI to help me do routine things, or to remind me to do things, or to say, hey, you think you're going to do this, but did you know there's a blocker over here to doing that? I'm looking for AI to save me to do the things that are hard for a computer to do, and more important, that a human does them. But that's a great question. I love that. And if I didn't answer your question, let us know.
Okay, great stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the mistakes I've seen organizations that are new to the cloud do is they know there's scalability. They've heard scale up and scale out. They know that scale out means adding more compute typically, or adding better or faster storage, or going from this type of storage to that type of storage. But they don't truly look at all the possibilities. So, there are some things like, I tend to talk about Azure a lot because that's what I work with, but I'm sure these things are available in most of the cloud providers. But for instance, there are things, if you're using Azure SQL DB, where you can set up, configure it, and use automation to automatically scale up the logical server that you're using, or to have databases share a pool of compute called elastic pools, to allow a bunch of databases to share a pre-reserved set of resources, so that no one database is going to fail, but gets to they get to share these resources. We typically don't have that elastic scale on-prem. And yes, people over the years have added cloud-like elastic scale to their on-prem stuff. But there are other ways in the Azure service offerings to scale up or scale out your databases. It's not just one way, there are many ways. And I think in the past, again, because we over provision compute and storage and databases for the just in case scenario, we data architects typically we're not used to thinking about all the ways we can scale, because we've already pre-purchased, prepaid for pre-capitalized all that space. And now we need to figure out, do we want to have it do it automatically? My answer is almost always yes, because I'm lazy and I hate 3 a.m. pages to say we ran out of storage room. But also, do we want some events to make it automatic, and others to make it so that it has to be manually done? And that's another place where I think AI could help us. So I'm just going to check, are there any other questions and comments?
Not right now.
Okay, perfect. Bring those in. Ask me a trivia question. Ask me about space. I don't know.
Oh, wait, here's one
So,
from Lynn that popped in. Lynn wants to know,
okay.
how should organizations approach the planning phase of a cloud migration?
Very carefully. Um, so that's what I've tried to include across this deck, like the do's and don'ts that I've separated. And I have some bonus tips that come at the end because I didn't think 10 were enough. But I'd say that what typically I've seen is that people start doing the planning with only the technical people. Like it's treated as an application development project, usually around one or two applications. I mean, I know some organizations have said, oh, we're just moving everything to the cloud. The cloud's new and it's got the new car smell and we're very happy with it. But most organizations don't do that. Most organizations try to do a proof of concept, or maybe they move a business line to the cloud or a department or something like that. I have some tips coming later, but I'll just give you a preview of them. I think it's important that we not treat cloud, the first set of, maybe the first year or two of cloud migration planning as just a technical thing. When you do this cloud migration, it's not that, I mean, I think it's better, but it's not that it's just better, it's different. So, for instance, you're going to need legal and compliance people. You're going to need privacy people because data sovereignty, like where the data goes, where it's allowed to go, where it's persisted, how it can be used in different locations, who has access to it, all of that is different in the cloud. So you'll need to rely on some business people on the other side. And I don't just mean end users. I don't just mean the management. I mean, to help make those decisions and do the cost, benefit, and risk of those things is going to be important. But I started this deck and I started looking at some of my slides and I thought, no, those are general planning questions. I don't want this to be a whole presentation about how do you do planning, but how do you do planning specifically for cloud migrations? So there's all that thing like stakeholder buy-in. One big mistake I saw once is a business end user had been to a conference, one of those C-level and above conferences, where they got a bunch of presentations about how great the cloud is. They got to go helicopter skiing or whatever it is that C-level people get to do at their conferences. And they came home and they're like, yeah, we're going to do this. This is so great. We're going to save billions of dollars and everything. He had the buy-in, but the rest of the company didn't have the buy-in. And he also had, we'll call it extremely outrageous expectations about how long it was going to take and how much it was going to cost and how cost savings, if they happened at all, how they were going to happen. So I'd say the most important thing about cloud migration planning are generally good planning practices, but making sure that everyone understands, you'll keep hearing me say this, cost, benefit, and risks of every decision, how it plays, that we can't just choose one thing in a plan and try to optimize, say, for cost savings, because there can be cloud migration tasks that aren't going to save you money right off the bat, but maybe it's just a better way of doing things. So that's my number one tip there. And I'd love to do a whole presentation on just preparing the plan. So,
well, here's a question from Joel.
Yeah.
Do you think that the existing on-premises system specs, such as OS and type of DB, is a strong point to determine which cloud the migration must be?
Yeah.
Example, predominant on-premises based on Windows Server and SQL Server makes Azure the preferred option?
Well, as much as I want to agree with that, I'm not sure it's really true, because you can run Windows Server and SQL DB on a VM, I think, in any cloud provider. And in fact, you can run Oracle in Azure. The cloud providers today are more of infrastructure providers. I mean, they have their specialized versions. You can only run Azure SQL DB in the Azure cloud. You can't run Azure SQL DB in the Google Cloud or AWS, but a flavor of SQL Server could be anywhere. I do think that the bigger differentiation between, I'll call it the three major cloud providers, so AWS, Google, and Azure, is more about what do their services work like. So in my layperson's opinion, I believe that Azure is focused primarily along a wide spectrum of enterprise users. Their tools, I find, their portal is much easier to use. And I find that AWS is more focused, their tools and services more focuses on the tech crowd and less so than people outside of IT. And I think that's just a reflection of Microsoft's history of also developing and delivering both consumer and end user tools and their focus on usability and everything. But that's just an opinion I have. I haven't worked much with Google Cloud, but I've heard similar things. But definitely, one of the reasons to do that inventory at the beginning is to try to figure out where the best fit is. And from other presentations I've done here before, is I don't think you should plan on being multi-cloud. Like, don't make that your plan at the start if you're just moving to the cloud, but realizing eventually you'll probably end up multi-cloud, and definitely you will end up hybrid cloud, meaning still things on-prem and some things in the cloud.
Okay,
so
great.
some don'ts here. Don't underestimate the impact of these new cost models. It's not necessarily things are more costly. It's just like I consider data in the cloud now like as if we all had to go back to paying per minute for long distance. We don't want to do that. But if we did, maybe our cell phone bills would go way down because we'd only be paying for more costly things when we use them. I don't want to go back to that, but if I had to, I'd go back to having very short phone calls when I talk to people who didn't live near me. All the cloud providers provide some really good online calculators, but I find because the calculators can't take into account every variable, every question you might have, that I highly recommend. And I don't really do this as a professional service. I do assist my clients in doing this. But I would say if you're doing your first migrations, definitely you want to hire or engage experienced architects who know real world impacts of configuration and service questions. Don't underestimate the impact of change on people. And one of my first cloud migrations I worked on, we had a ton of experts. And when I say experts, I mean deep experts in all the on-prem tech. And you know what? They were highly skeptical of moving anything to the cloud. They said the cloud was something to be feared for. It wasn't safe. It was too expensive. The vendors will peek at your data. They said all these outrageous things that just haven't panned out. We spent a lot of time dealing with the personal side of experts in on-prem tech who I think were expressing their fear that they were going to lose their expert status because things were different in the cloud. The other one I work with all the time, I'm working with a consultant now on something not related to cloud architectures, but she literally goes into every system and downloads all the data into a spreadsheet and then works only with that spreadsheet. It's so ingrained to how she works and how she thinks. She wants to work locally with data. And we're working closely with her to try to get her to understand why that's not going to work, why it's a huge risk to the company. She's not quite understanding. She just knows that we don't want her to work the way she wants to work. The other one we've struggled with, not managers who want to budget for upfront costs. I mean, they still need to do budgets. We still need to allocate things. But we have to realize that our spend is going to be more blippy because our cloud use is more blippy. And then the other one, this used to be a huge problem, but now not so much. In a lot of industries, capitalizing your costs, meaning treating it with depreciation, is an important part of their business. So one of my clients, a large utility, they want to capitalize all their costs because operational costs, the shareholders have to eat, and capitalized costs, the uh, regulatory boards will let them recoup those in their billable rates to their customers. So now there's a way with most cloud providers to turn what used to be only an operational cost into a capital cost by reserving capacity ahead of time, which allows you to treat it like a capital cost. But these are examples of people we need to include in our migration planning and address them as individuals that have expertise, that want to learn these things, but they might have reservations because we're asking them to think and feel and do their own cost, benefit, and risk assessments differently, sometimes differently than they've done for 30 years. And it's a big change for them. Don't underestimate the impact of these. Like I said, calculators work, but there's can be issues. So the
Okay,
other thing
Karen,
yeah, go ahead.
Before you get to 9, here's a question from Paul. What's the best way or ways to avoid cloud bloat when undergoing the cloud migration process?
So I'm assuming that cloud bloat means scope creep. I'm not sure. Or does it mean sticking everything in the cloud because it's there and you can put it there? I'm not sure what we mean here, but I'll address both of them. So scope creep, managing scope creep, just like on any other project. Like set your scope and then do change management, governance, project governance, program governance to measure the cost, benefit, and risk of scope creep. As for bloat of let's just put everything there, well, that's also a governance thing, but I think the advent of data lakes and data fabrics, even data meshes can lead to that. I think it's all a people problem. Jerry Weinberg says all problems are people problems, and he's not down on people. It just means we have to manage people and decisions and everything that way. Okay. Let me know in the Q&A if you meant something else. Here's another thing that gets left off, often because of how we budget projects, how we allocate projects. Once you get things in the cloud, you are not done with your migration at all. I don't care what your project manager tells you. I don't care what your project charter tells you until you have set up, defined, measured, tweaked, and configured that you need different kinds of monitoring in the cloud. The cost things we've talked about, the scaling, how failovers work, and monitoring, is your cloud service provider, are those things up and running? So before you start paging your DBA, you need to find out if your cloud provider is suffering an outage, but you still might want to page your DBA because they'll need to be around for when it comes back online. But those are things. So people often forget once they've put everything there, that the supporting systems for systems also need to change. Also, don't forget that some post-migration systems like monitoring, alerting, measuring, event management, providing metrics, doing analytics on system metrics, they might already be included in the cloud service you're paying for. That does not mean that you can't use third-party systems to do those things because you want to integrate it with everything on-prem or anything. But I've also seen people migrate things to the cloud and they're still paying for third-party services and still using them, often a tool that they bought 10 years ago that's barely able to support cloud resources when the cloud service itself had its own basic monitoring and alerting and everything, but no one considered that. Any more comments or questions? There's
yes,
more.
We do.
Oh, good. Perfect. I love it.
Well, first of all, Paul just wanted to clarify that he did mean cloud bloat, meaning scope creep, cloud resource waste, and things like that. And he thanks you for answering the question.
Okay.
So go ahead.
Perfect. Okay, so there's more because 10 isn't enough. I'm going to go through these really quickly, but here's my plan for AI assisted everything. So even if your current plan is not to use any of that AI stuff. So again, I'm just now starting to work with Copilot for Defender, Copilot for Power BI, Copilot for Data Fabric, Copilot for all of these, Copilot for SQL Server, because I'm so looking forward to AI assistance in what I do. But I think your plans now that these things are out, now that we have Gemini, now that we have Copilot, now that we have all these LLMs and generative AI, and who knows what else is coming down the pipe to help us in IT, they're going to be there. So even if your decision is, we're not going to use those, we're going to wait, we're going to let everyone else use them, whatever it is we want to do, but that needs to be in your plan, that you've done the cost, benefit, and risk and asked the questions. Again, I'm marginally biased here, but I don't do this regularly. But I know people who do, is that for your first migrations, you 100% want technical resources who have experience in that cloud provider with that kind of service type. Now, as you get more mature, as you build your own in-house techniques, then you can talk about providing, help that works with other clouds, that works with other service types. But when you first start, especially if it's a proof of concept, you want some expertise. And people who have experience in migrating to those, not everyone who has experience doing them. And then you also should add process resources. This is more what I do, but to help assist with the people challenges, to help make smart decisions, to help collaboration, to document and mitigate the costs and risks. Don't use the same strategies. You're going to draw from them, but you're not going to use the same strategies that you use solely for on-prem. Don't assume your on-prem tools will work the same, even if they can connect. Don't forget about physics. Sometimes people do what I call a sort of migration. It's still a migration, but an example would be just lift and shift. So you have databases and VMs on-prem, and now you're going to stand up a VM in the cloud and you're going to put your database on it. That's still in the cloud, but sometimes there's not as many benefits to doing that way. And in fact, that's why Microsoft came out with something called managed instances for SQL Server. So it was a bit more cloudy, but still much like managing your own VMs. Also, remember that configurations have consequences. So some of your configuration things, especially around databases, you can't do because it's running in the cloud and you don't have access to the underlying storage if it's a database as a service. And also remember that some services, like deploying a giant data warehouse, you can turn it on and turn it off and save money. But then you have to budget for the warming up the server and getting everything going again. And I'm specifically going through these fast because these are bonus ones. Don't forget that cloud services get frequent updates. So you need to allocate resources, people, to stay on top of the changes. One of the great things the cloud providers have done is they tend not to roll out breaking changes, which is good. But if you're used to holding off on updates till the company's ready for an update, you don't get to do that. You guys should see me talking with my hands, and to review the costs regularly. So those are all the tips I had. And I just wanted to remind everybody that I'm Karen. I'm Data Chick almost anywhere, and I'd love to hear from you via email or on any of those social media. But now we have time for the last Q&A. If there's any more questions.
Yes, we do have several questions. I'd like to remind the audience that we can take questions up until about 5 minutes to the top of the hour in order to give you a short break before the next session. Mm-hmm. So let's get through the ones we have here. We'll just go first come, first serve. If you're following along, Karen, so that means I'll be asking the questions from the bottom of the console.
Yeah.
So let's get started. How do we convince staff who don't trust cloud vendors to be on board?
That's a tough one because I've also specialized in troubled projects, and a lot of time people are troublesome. I don't know if anyone else in the world experiences this, um, but some people can be supported. I know I've worked with experts, again, people who were used to turning all the knobs and flipping all the switches on SQL Server. They were wizards with doing that. And then when you move to database as a service, there aren't the same knobs and switches, and they feel left out, and they try to make everyone afraid that it won't perform because I can't stripe data across files anymore because you can't have access to that. And so some people, though, you give them a big budget on learning and maybe certifications and training, they can make that move because, I mean, most humans are interested in learning new things just in general. But some people just had to be left supporting. They weren't interested in learning something new. I hear this all the time. I'm within 2 years of retirement. I'm not interested in learning all this stuff that's different. Just let me take care of the on-prem stuff. Sometimes that's a great fit. Sometimes people leave to go work with an organization that isn't cloudy. It all just depends. But this is where, there are experts out there that help you work with people who struggle with big changes to what their knowledge base needs to be and what they need to learn. Also,
Okay.
Bonuses are also very good. I just wanted to speak on behalf of every man.
All right. Next question. How do we get better cost estimates?
Oh, gosh. So like I said, the online calculators, they do a pretty good job. They're like, how much is this Cybertruck going to cost? Well, you go online and you look. What's the cheapest one with no configuration? What's the most expensive one with all the options? And you can do that. I did mention third-party resources, meaning people or organizations that can help you do that. There are also, now that cloud's been around for a while, there are also tools that you can purchase that will help you do finer grain, that will ask you more detailed questions, that you can even upload your metrics into to help you make better cost estimates. So people making money off the cloud without being in the cloud, which is not a bad thing.
All right. Let's try to squeeze in one or two more questions.
Yeah.
Here's the first one. What do you mean about tools not working for the cloud?
So we all struggled with this when cloud things were new. The connection strings are different. The way you connect to things, maybe with AD and maybe with logins. But they're just these little things that happen. Like I had a question the other day at Build where someone said, we can't get our application to work with our cloud database because it needs to use named instances, and those cloud databases don't support that. And the answer was, well, those databases don't support, or that application doesn't support named instances. And what that means is now you're left with a choice. Do you change your tool? Do you change your app? Do you lean heavily on your app vendor, your tool vendor, to start implementing these? Or do you not use, for that system, you don't use a cloud-based database because you can't connect to them with a named instance? These are these little devils in the details type things.
Yes. Let's try to wrap this up. One more question. How do you assess which applications are suitable for migration to the cloud and which should remain on premises?
Okay, well, there's a whole bunch of things go in there. So one of the big ones is data sovereignty. I live in Canada. We think about that a lot. I know people in Europe think about that, and that's why, many cloud providers have cloud options where your data all stays in Europe, usually Germany. In Canada, we have certain services we can use. If we have to keep all the data, even while it's in transit, staying in Canada, then there are some services we can use in the cloud and some we can't. So data sovereignty is a big one. Other compliance issues, also a big one. I think the big question is that, it's all the variables, it's compliance, it's governance, and then cost, benefit, and risk. And once you get through those, now you're left with, does it make sense to put our system over there? Like, what are we going to use in the cloud to get the benefit and to pay for? And what features that might be available there that we would never use? So it is a big question that has a big it depends. I just think we have more things it depends on than when we were all on-prem.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, back to moderate the second session of our summit, the biggest hurdles of cloud migration and how to avoid them, presented by CoreView, 1111 Systems, and EGI Innovations. Our speaker for this session is Elias Knazer, a thought leader in the areas of cloud computing and digital disruption. Until recently, Elias was a research vice president at Gartner, where he spent 7 years focusing on private, hybrid, and public cloud computing. Today, Elias continues to conduct research and advice and engage customers and vendors on all aspects of cloud, edge, and data center transformation strategies. He's well known for his ability to simplify complex technical concepts and explain how IT aligns with and forwards business goals. Elias, I'm sorry. It's great to have you here. Please take it away.
David, thank you so much for that nice introduction, and thank you for the opportunity. And hello, everyone. I am going to take you through this second session, which is near and dear to my heart. I've spoken about this topic in particular for many, many years with many, many customers. So let's get started. We talk about hurdles. We always talk about hurdles in the cloud, but what are these hurdles? So what I want to first do is kind of throw the kitchen sink at you. I want to talk about all of these hurdles, kind of just lay them out, and then we'll start to dissect them sort of a little by little. Now, the number one hurdle that I always hear when I'm talking about cloud migration in particular is cost. Cost comes up all the time. We obsess over cost. Now, I'm not going to talk about how we overcome these hurdles just yet. I just want to lay them out first of all. The second one that I hear a lot about is security, privacy, sovereignty. The earlier speaker mentioned that also as a hurdle for potentially choosing which applications remain on premises, which applications go to the cloud. And I think if she had a little more time, she would have elaborated. But I think in one of my slides, I'm going to answer specifically that question. So if the person that asked that question is still around, stick around. I think I've got a good answer for you there. A lock-in is another one. So folks are afraid of going to the cloud because, oh my gosh, we are going to be locked in with cloud provider A or cloud provider B, as if we are not locked in with a bunch of providers on premises today, but lock-in comes up a lot, as I'm sure you know. Skills is a fair hurdle. Now, there's a shortage of skills across the board, I think, in the industry in general, and skills definitely become a hurdle for cloud migration, for adoption, for successful completion. And believe it or not, before I even go to some of the other hurdles, all of those impact cost, right? So every decision that you're going to make is going to have an immediate cost implication. Now, complexity, depending on the types of applications, depending on the environment you have, depending on what you've got on premises, migrating that to the cloud could be complex. It could be difficult. And again, complexity leads to what? Complexity requires good skills. Complexity could potentially lead to cost. So these things are all kind of intertwined. Disruption. The more complex the environment, the more that you have to do, the more potential for disruption, which means downtime. This is if you need to move stuff to the cloud, sometimes you can't move it while it's live, right? You have to maybe clone the environment. Maybe there's a cutover. Maybe there's a retraining phase for your users. So there's a lot of things that can potentially go in that could cause disruption. Performance and reliability. Again, you've been doing something on premises for a very long time in a certain way, and you've got the performance, the reliability the way you want it. And although I would argue forever that the cloud will probably give you better performance and better reliability, it doesn't matter because the environment is already fine-tuned on premises. And while it can be maybe even better fine-tuned in the cloud, that doesn't mean that on day one that will be the case. So performance and reliability become another hurdle that you now have to adopt to the cloud provider, to those capabilities that you've been given. And then data migration, of course. So you probably have a ton of data on premises, right? So are you going to move all of that data to the cloud? Are you going to move some of it to the cloud? Are you going to move it to multiple clouds? Are you going to move it to a cloud adjacent type of architecture? What are you going to do with this data, and how are you going to migrate it if you are going to migrate it? So we're going to talk about all of these things. But on top of all of that, the hurdles then become, what are we doing with cloud? Are we going to leverage multi-cloud out the gate, which means I'm going to adopt AWS and I'm going to adopt Azure, or I'm going to adopt Google and I'm going to adopt Oracle or IBM or whatever? Is that my strategy? Is that my approach? Is that the first step? Am I doing multi-cloud out the gate, or is that kind of a second phase? What are the implications on some of the tools, some of the skill selections that I'm making? That becomes another hurdle. Or am I going to stay hybrid, right? So which one am I going to do? I mean, you're going to be hybrid by default, in my opinion. Anytime you're going to extend anything out of your data center, you're hybrid by default, whether it's hybrid cloud or architecture or infrastructure, you're going to be hybrid. But then how do I marry this hybrid multi-cloud environment, and how do I get all of this complexity to then work together, knowing that you're not getting rid of the on-premises data center? And what does all of this do to my skills and my cost in particular? All of these are hurdles, right? No matter how you slice it, you've got hurdles. And one of the best ways to overcome a hurdle is what? It is to have a structure. It is to have a plan. It is to have a strategy. So not having a strategy is your biggest hurdle. Everything I talked about, and everything I'm going to talk about after this particular slide is going to bring you back to strategy. If you don't have a good strategy in place, everything else that you're going to do is going to feel discombobulated. It's not going to work right. It's not part of a process. It's not part of a system. And oftentimes what I found is customers underestimate what it means to have a cloud strategy. Because for some customers, a cloud strategy is just a two-page document. My strategy is to be multi-cloud, or my strategy is to be hybrid cloud, bada bing, bada boom, we're off to the races. That is not a strategy. So having a strategy requires, again, a process, a system. What does it mean when I say have a cloud strategy? Cloud strategy is a three-tiered approach, at least in my opinion. You want to have your cloud strategy document. That is the overarching document. That is the why you're even considering cloud. That is your executive summary. That is going to lay out the business reasons why you're migrating to cloud. That's going to lay out the vision, the requirements. All of these are going to go into why. That is that one short document, 5 to 10 pages potentially, that anyone can potentially pick up, read, and understand what the company's cloud strategy is. It is not typically a technical document. It is not typically lengthy in nature. On the contrary, it is geared towards being a business type document that an executive can pick up, understand what the cloud strategy is for the organization, understand why we're even considering cloud, yada, yada, yada. The number two document is a cloud adoption framework. Now, the cloud adoption framework is a crucial document as part of this cookbook, this toolkit that I'm talking about here when I talk about strategy. The cloud adoption framework is when and what, right? So earlier, one of you asked, which applications do I move to the cloud? That is part of your cloud adoption framework. The cloud adoption framework is your roadmap. It is a list of things, a list of tasks, a list of deliverables that you have to do in a particular order, in a particular system. This is what you're going to lay out. This is your roadmap. If I need to do 1, 2, 3, and I need to do it in this order, and I need to engage these teams. You can think of it as your project management, so to speak, but it is not exactly that. It is more a listing of the things that you need to tackle on your way to this cloud adoption. This is also not a very lengthy document, but it is a document that you are going to need to involve subject matter experts in. You're going to need to involve the technical team, the business team, etc., to put together this framework. Once you have the framework, now it's time to implement this framework. So now that you have the framework and you know that as part of this framework, for example, there is a couple of different deliverables for the security team to come up with. That is what translates into your implementation plans. Those are your implementation documents. These are the lengthy documents, the technical documents, the detailed documents. This is what the networking team is going to work on, and the security team is going to work on, and the governance team is going to work on. They're going to take everything that is in this adoption framework and translate it into how-to documents, essentially. Those are typically long. So all of this is part of your strategy. And when you're following a system, when you're following a structure, then you're going to start seeing that the hurdles that we're putting into place will start to one by one sort of address themselves. And hence why, I didn't lead with, well, how do we address cost? Well, because it's not that simple. Everything kind of ties into cost, and we'll get to cost in a little bit. Number two is ownership of the cloud migration process. So that's another hurdle that I found. Now that you have your cloud strategy, you've built the structure, you've built the system, you've built the implementation, someone has to own it. Someone has to be responsible for it. It cannot be a team effort. We're all going to do this. You have to be able to hold someone accountable for either the success or the failure of your cloud implementation. Now, you can call this person whatever you'd like to call them. They could be the project administrator. They could be the cloud architect. They could be the cloud business administrator. Whatever this person is, there should be one person that is responsible for this cloud project. And this person will also have duties that they need to do. This person will be, for example, responsible for delivering that cloud strategy document. This person will be responsible for delivering the cloud adoption framework, for overseeing the preparation in the cloud implementation plans, those detailed plans we talked about. So as part of the cloud strategy, this person will also be responsible for finding an executive sponsor, a business sponsor. Again, we talked about the cloud strategy document needs to be a document for why. This is not something that IT is going to be able to answer. The cloud projects remind me a lot of BCDR projects. Back in the day, BCDR projects that didn't have executive sponsors, IT would just come up with RPOs and RTOs. And I can't tell you how many times I've sat with IT professionals. I'm like, where'd you get these RTOs and RPOs from? Like, how did you know that, it's okay for this application to be down for 5 hours? The reality is BCDR projects are not really IT projects either. I actually don't think there are any IT projects. There are only business projects. But to highlight this, again, BCDR project, where do you get RTOs and RPOs? Typically from some kind of a risk assessment plan that the business has done that gives you this input. The business gives you the input that then you translate into technical. The same thing here. If you're moving along cloud, but you don't have executive sponsorship, you don't have an executive umbrella that's kind of pushing this forward, that doesn't understand how you're going to take cloud and use it as a differentiator, as an income generator, not necessarily as an IT tool, then you're missing out. So it is the responsibility of this, let's call project administrator, to find the business sponsor, to ideate on the cloud strategy document, to document the strategy, to communicate the strategy, to translate the business outcomes into technical requirements with the cloud implementation plans that we talked about, to lead the program and make sure that you have a solid foundation. So not having someone that is leading causes delays and causes confusion, and these are some of the hurdles that you will be challenged with. Number three, we talked a little bit earlier about cloud skills shortage. This one is crucial. Now, it is imperative that you understand that the skills that you have on premises from a technical perspective, those shouldn't translate to the cloud. Like, you don't want to take what you've learned on premises and implement that in the cloud, because that is going to have an immediate cost implication. What I tell customers all the time, anytime we do something in IT, it has a cost implication. But on premises, we were always able to kind of get away with it, right? So if you happen to order an extra server, that's okay. We'll find use for it. If you happen to order 2 or 3 trays of extra storage, yes, it's expensive. Obviously, we're paying for it. But it wasn't the end of the world. We found use for it. Create more virtual machines. The challenge that you're going to have in the cloud is every technical decision you make on the cloud or in the cloud is going to have an immediate cost implication. And what I mean by that is it is going to be a recurring cost that you're going to incur immediately at the end of the month. You're going to receive that bill that, you know, the finance department or whoever is constantly going to be challenging on and talking about. Hence why you can't design the way you design on premises. You can't do things the way you've done on premises. You have to be able to evolve these skills all across the board, whether it's networking or security or automation or cost optimization or containers, whatever it is. I'm going to give you simple examples here that I always give because it's easy to understand. On premises, let's say you had a web server farm that consists of 20 web servers. If you take 20 web servers and you simply move them from point A to point B, then you have saved zero money. You've simply traded one virtualization abstraction layer for another virtualization abstraction layer. But if you have evolved your skill set and understand how the cloud works, then instead of doing that, you're going to take these servers inside of the web server farm. You're going to create an auto scaling group, and you're potentially going to deploy 3 instances of those servers in that auto scaling group. And then you're going to create rules around, hey, if CPU utilization hits 50%, deploy another server. If memory utilization hits 90% or 80%, deploy another server. If it drops below a certain threshold, remove servers. By doing that, now you've optimized this workload. Now you've impacted cost. Now it's going to cost you less for operating on the cloud. And the same thing is going to go for a lot of other things. If you've got a load balancer on premises from a third-party vendor, you move that into a virtual appliance from a third-party vendor, that is going to cost you more. But if you take a look at the native load balancers that the cloud provider offers, you might find that you're going to be able to save on licensing immediately because that's going to be cheaper. But you're also going to save on, you are now no longer responsible for patching this load balancer. You are no longer responsible for making it highly available and scalable, right? That's the whole point of going to the cloud. So you've reduced the license cost, you've reduced the operational cost, immediate cost savings, and so on and so forth. I can give the same example on databases and a whole slew of other things. Now, some of you will probably say, but Eli, multi-cloud, when in a multi-cloud world, am I supposed to use native tools or third-party tools because I then have single point of management across everything? Fair point. If that is something that you are concerned with, make that one of the questions you ask at the end, and we'll spend some time on that because the answer is a little elusive, but it's a fair point. Now, in the cloud, you also want to make sure that you're understanding APIs, whether it's API to one cloud provider, multiple cloud providers, to your SaaS providers, to IoT, to network. APIs are going to be king. API everywhere. You need to understand API as part of your education process. Now, the question that I get asked the most is, hey, Eli, how do we build these skills? Do we just go out and hire? Do we train? How do we train? And my advice to the business side of things is to develop a talent enablement program. The answer is not always to hire. The answer is to give your existing team also career advancement capabilities. Sometimes you're going to need to hire. Hiring is good. You want to mint the team with additional capabilities and experience. But create a talent enablement program. Create a culture of continuous learning. Make sure that you publish the skill sets that you need. This is another example. Another funny thing that I'll tell you. You know, maybe this was 15, 20 years ago. I was still in the corporate world, and we didn't have a skills transparency list. You know, my manager would come to me and say, hey, Eli, you know, I've got, you know, about $5,000 left in the budget for training. What kind of training do you want? At the time, this is a true story. This actually happened. I'm like, I don't know. He's like, just pick something, go take a course. I'm like, VMware. I don't know what this is, but I'll go take it. And this was, I'm talking ESX infrastructure 2.4, a very early days virtualization. I go in, I spend the money, but there was no reason for me to spend this money, right? It wasn't part of a grand plan. I just, hey, you know, take a course. Okay, I'll take a course. I went there. By day 3, I came back. I'm like, we're going to virtualize everything. Everyone was laughing at me. But the point is, instead of letting the employee decide what kind of skill training they need, the business should take the initiative and say, for my organization, for you to be relevant within my organization, these are the skills that I need you to be proficient at. Don't go take VMware courses if I'm looking for cloud courses. Don't go take, security courses if I'm looking for governance or automation, et cetera, et cetera. So publishing a transparency list that highlights what's important for our organization for the next 5 years is automation, is cost optimization, is governance, whatever it is, write that down and make that available so everyone can see it, can use it. Having a skills gap assessment is important. That can be done by you as an individual to understand where your skills gap assessment is, but it also should be done by the business to understand where the gaps are within the team so that you can hire or train accordingly. So doing that is important. And finally, an apprenticeship program. I strongly believe in an apprenticeship program because someone might be a very senior person in one area, but might be a very junior person in another area. And being able to help one another is crucial. It's important for you to grow as an individual, but it's also, there's a sense of satisfaction of being able to help someone else or teach someone else. You were not born with these skills and this knowledge. Someone also helped you. So it is your duty to do the same for others. So building an apprenticeship program is very fulfilling, and I think it could be a lot of fun for organizations. This is a way for you to develop these skills, whether you're hiring and you're building an apprenticeship program to help the existing individuals, or whether you're doing this internally. I think this would be fantastic. Number 4, application portfolio assessment. Now, this one becomes fun. Now, someone earlier session asked about, hey, which applications should I move to the cloud? Which ones should I keep on premises? And the previous presenter brought up a good point, which was, data sovereignty. It comes up a lot. But then data sovereignty can easily be solved by, okay, well, I'll just use a cloud provider in that country, right? Well, I mean, if it's Canada, then I'll use AWS, Azure, Google, whoever's there, and we could potentially solve that problem. Now, when you're trying to decide on which application moves to the cloud, which one stays on premises, this is again where this process that I'm talking about comes into play. I kind of regret not having another slide here that shows the process, but I'm going to try to go through it as quickly as possible. I'll try to explain what it entails. But you have to subject your applications, each application you have, to a set of challenges, set of questions, to a process that determines whether that application belongs in the cloud or not. For example, the beginning of the process is, hey, well, which applications are we going to assess for the cloud? Well, I would answer immediately, well, you can either use your most important applications or your least important applications. Great. Which ones are my most important? Which ones are my least important? This takes us back to that BCDR conversation. If there is a risk assessment that's been done to the organization, then you should be able to highlight, you should know what the most important applications are and the least important applications are. If that doesn't exist, a business impact analysis is what it's called. If that doesn't exist, then the second level is use RTOs and RPOs. Most of us probably have RTOs and RPOs that are assigned to these applications. Whether they come from the BIA or not, that's a different story, but we probably have them. Use the RTOs and RPOs to classify the most important and least important applications. Once you have those, then you start putting them through the process. First question in the process, what is my risk for putting this application in the cloud? Meaning, if I put this application in the cloud and there's some kind of an outage, is there a risk of loss of life? Maybe if you're a hospital or some kind of, in the medical field, maybe if you put that application in the cloud, could there be a threat to loss of life? Maybe. That is a threat. Could there be a loss of revenue if you're in a different type of industry? Maybe. Is there a security issue? By starting to ask these questions, you highlight the initial hurdles for these applications. So let's start with the one I asked. If there's a risk to loss of life, then is there any reason for you to continue maybe with this process? Yeah, if there's a way for you to overcome this in the cloud, then you can continue to the next question. If you find that, hey, no, there is no way for me to overcome this application has to stay on premises because I've got redundancy across the street, because, then this application is already not a good candidate for the cloud. You stop right here. You don't even continue with the process. But if you highlight some hurdles that potentially loss of revenue, maybe we can come up with a good technical solution for this. And as a result, the answer is yes. Now I move to the next step. How do I get around this? Maybe the way you get around this is you deploy in multiple regions. Maybe you deploy across multiple availability zones. So you're raising your availability, your resiliency levels, and you keep going, right? You keep going through the process until you get to, well, how am I going to move this application? Is it going to be a lift and shift, kind of what I have here, which is a rehost, or am I going to maybe refactor the application a little bit, which is I'm not going to just lift and shift it, but I'm going to do what I talked about earlier with the web server farm. I'm going to move it, but I'm going to put an auto scaling group. I'm going to move it, but I'm going to use a native load balancer. I'm going to move it, but I'm going to use the database as a service that the cloud providers offer. Is that the right choice? Most of the time, that's probably the right choice. Well, maybe we're going to revise the application, meaning maybe we're going to take some of its components and leverage past services. Maybe we're going to do containers around it, et cetera, et cetera. That's revising the architecture of the application. Maybe we rewrite the application. We're going to start from scratch. We're just going to rewrite this whole thing. Maybe we'll use, I don't know, microservices. Maybe we'll use a bunch of containers, maybe past services. But basically, we're rewriting the whole thing. Or we're going to replace this application. So we're going to go from what we have, which is probably an off-the-shelf application on-prem, and maybe we're going to use some kind of a SaaS offering. That's another option. So again, this process, all along the process, you're going to come across these questions. And one of the questions is going to be, what is it going to cost to operate in the cloud? Because there might be a showstopper for using SaaS. Because I'm going to try to go as quickly as possible here. It's just a lot of information. Oftentimes, folks think that just because there's a SaaS alternative, SaaS is the default. That's not true. Sometimes when you're evaluating SaaS, you're going to realize that SaaS doesn't have the same feature sets and capabilities that your application on premises has. Sometimes that you're going to realize that the disruption, the amount of training that you need to do on this new SaaS application doesn't warrant. Sometimes the price increase isn't justified. Sometimes the SaaS application is hosted on a provider that maybe you don't like, or maybe is considered a competitor. So there's a lot of things. Maybe the SaaS offering exists, but it exists from a small company. And as a result, your risk for using the SaaS creates lock-in immediately. Remember here, lock-in is a problem, but I think people view lock-in in a different lens. I'm talking about lock-in with a provider of SaaS who is the only provider in this space. You're locked in just by using the SaaS provider. So all of these things are part of this application assessment process that I'm talking about, that you subject the applications to. And if the application can make it to the end of this process, then it either moves to the cloud, or somewhere along the process, this application gets a no and stays on premises. So instead of guessing, now you've created an entire process on how you're going to do this application. Yes, it's long. Yes, it's exhaustive. Yes, there are tools that you can leverage. The tools will only get you so far. You're still going to have to do 40, 50% of the work. If you don't have time, this is where you hire, consultants and folks to help you, but you're still going to be involved at some level because you are the one that knows your domain, knows these applications the most. Finally, we get to cost management. And, when I do this, sometimes I'm like, well, cost is number 5. Yeah, cost is number 5, because everything we just talked about up until now impacts cost. Every single thing that we talked about impacts cost. If you don't have the right skills and you're architecting the migration to the cloud the wrong way, guess what? Your costs are going to skyrocket. If you haven't understood the application migration process, your costs are going to skyrocket. If you don't have a cloud strategy, costs are going to skyrocket. So yeah, it comes in at number 5. Now, when you're doing cost, in addition to everything that we said, you want to be able to understand that modifying the application architecture, you want to modify it for the cloud. So that doesn't mean that, hey, Eli is saying we're never going to do a lift and shift. That's not true. Actually, that is another hurdle. People think that either you have to modify the application in some way, shape, or form, or you never move it as a lift and shift. It's not true. A lot of applications will be a lift and shift. My preference, if you could, instead of a lift and shift, do a refactoring. Again, the example I gave on the web servers, try to change some of the components so that they leverage cloud capabilities, and then continuously optimize. But lift and shift should not be a showstopper. You're going to have some applications where it's inevitable where you lift and shift them. Long migration process could also impact cost. Now, look, let me answer this question flat out. If you're not getting rid of your on-premises data center, no matter what you do, no matter how you migrate to the cloud, it's going to cost you more. Why? You're not getting rid of something. So you're keeping the on-premises data center and you're adding cloud. No matter how you add it, no matter how you do this, it's going to cost more. You're adding something. Now, if you were to say, hey, I'm getting out of the data center completely, and I'm going to move completely 100% into the cloud, then we can talk about whether cloud could be cheap or not cheaper than on-premises? And I would make the argument that yes, it can be cheaper than on-premises if you want to get rid of it completely. So extended, dragged migration processes will cost more in consultants, in training, in a whole slew of things. So make sure you have a good timeline, a good strategy to implement that. We talked a lot about investing in skills. That's going to help. Investing in tools. That will also help you significantly, especially from a cost perspective. If there's a single tools group, let's call it, that would be perfect for you to invest in, that gives you that single pane of glass, I would say it's cost management. With these cost management tools, you're able to know how much are you using a particular instance. Are you using 50% of the instance CPU or using 80%? If you're using 20% of the CPU's instance over 6 months, maybe it's time to change the instance. Do you have reserved instances on it or not? It'll highlight all of these gaps that will help you have a single pane of glass across multiple cloud providers, and it'll give you recommendations on how you can save money. So investing in a good third-party cloud cost tool, I think that would be crucial. Troubleshooting, performance monitor, and other issues, all of these are going to cost, right? That's downtime, that's disruption, that's complexity. So all of these will increase cost. And then end user cloud adoption. That could be costly too, right? Because now you're showing the user that's been doing something that's been working in a certain way for the last 20, 30 years, you're showing them something new. That's going to take time. It's going to take persistence. It's going to take patience, something that yours truly doesn't have a lot of. But you're going to have to invest a lot in end user adoption, showing them why it's important, why it's different, how it's going to benefit them. Always make it about them. It's not about you. It's not about anyone else. It's about why they should be using it, how it's going to help them accomplish their tasks and generate more revenue for the business in a better or maybe speedier way. Number 6, lock-in. Now, lock-in is probably one of my favorite topics to talk about because it's funny. Everybody talks about lock-in, and when they talk about lock-in, they talk about lock-in like they just discovered something. Like, ooh, but what about lock-in in the cloud? Well, what do you mean? You've got on-premises, you're locked in with Oracle, you're locked in with your mainframe, you're locked in with Unix, you're locked in with VMware, you're locked in with Microsoft, with Cisco. The list goes on. How is that any different? Like, we've made such a big deal out of lock-in, and I'm like, but we have lock-in. Like, why is it a problem in the cloud? I'm going to talk about what I mean by lock-in is good in a second. But another way to reduce lock-in, because you're never going to be able to eliminate lock-in, but you can significantly reduce lock-in, is by using cloud adjacency. I'm going to explain what that is in a second. And you can always get out of a lock-in, folks. And we'll talk about how you do that as well. Lock-in is good. It's not bad. Yeah, I'm trying to, for those of you that have watched Wall Street, greed is good, kind of play on words here. But lock-in is not bad, right? Lock-in gives you rich feature sets and capabilities. It gives you a broad ecosystem that you can leverage. It gives you support. Again, there's a reason why Oracle is one of the best databases in the world. There's significant lock-in there, but you also get significant features, significant capabilities, a great ecosystem to integrate with. It gives you very good support. And same thing with Microsoft and VMware and others. So lock-in is not necessarily a bad thing. Now, how do we reduce lock-in? This is something that I've been talking about since probably 2015, and for a long time, even when I was at Gartner, some Gartner analysts wouldn't agree with me on this. But this is a way to look at the architecture in a new way, in a modern way. Today, you probably have something like this. Your on-premises environment has direct connectivity or internet connectivity or some kind of a co-location connectivity to a cloud provider. Great, you leverage cloud services. What I am proposing here is either you move everything on premises into a co-location cage, bringing it closer to the cloud, or if you don't want to do that, at least have a presence in a co-location provider. What that allows you to do then is to have a high-speed, low-latency connection to multiple cloud providers. So not just like an AWS, it could be an AWS and an Azure and a Google and an IBM and an Oracle. And if you're in the financial world, maybe to the stock exchange, to the futures, to a whole slew of ecosystem. Now you've got direct fiber cross-connect connectivity to this entire ecosystem of capabilities. Why is this important? When I have high-speed, low-latency Eli, what do you mean by that? I am talking about, in some cases, sub-millisecond connectivity to these cloud providers. Impossible? I disagree. It's possible. I have videos on YouTube that will show you what I've done with, a crazy scenario where I have the quorum disk for a database of 2 nodes, one on AWS, one on Azure. I fail one of the nodes over from AWS to Azure, and you see how quickly it fails over. I do a ping test between AWS and the colo facility and Azure and the colo facility, 2 milliseconds, 3 milliseconds. This is from my house, right? This is not even in a cage. So if you see it there, you're going to see that yes, it's possible. Now, is it every single region is going to have this low latency? No, but this is your job now, right? So this is where you go into an Equinix or to a one of the other colo providers and say, hey, I'm interested in this region and your colo facility. Give me the latency, give me the performance data between these regions and your colo facility. That then informs you, that then educates you on what you can do. I have a lot of customers that will use a lot of compute capabilities from the cloud, but they'll put all of their data in a colo facility. Why? Because you've reduced lock-in. One of the biggest ways that you do lock-in in the cloud is what? It's data. You have a significant amount of data. You put that in the cloud without doing anything else, you're locked in. But if you can keep that data under your control, but point cloud services to that data, well, then you've maintained some level of Switzerland, right? So you have control over your data, you get around some sovereignty security issues potentially, but you're still leveraging cloud services, whether it's compute services, whether it's data warehousing services, database services. There's a whole slew of things that you can point to your data that doesn't necessarily have to be on the cloud provider storage subsystem. Now, the cloud providers have come a long way. For a while there, they required the data to be on their storage subsystem, and for some services, they still do. But for a large majority of services, you can point these services to storage and data that's not on their platform. And as a result, what you've created is cloud adjacency. Here's another example of how you could use this cloud adjacency. You've got a mainframe. We're never going to get rid of mainframes, folks, at least not while you and I are still working in the IT field. But instead of keeping the mainframe on premises where the latency between the mainframe and the AWS or Azure or Google Cloud, whatever, is probably high, you can move it cloud adjacent, move it closer to the cloud. And now any services that need to rely on the mainframe for whatever reason, you pretty much put the mainframe within land speed distance of these services. Maybe you've got Unix systems. You could do that as well. So there's a whole slew of things. You could also potentially use this architecture to exit the cloud. Instead of exiting the cloud and going completely back on premises, exit the cloud to the colo. Why? Well, a lot of these colos probably have compute as a service. So they'll give you some of the things that you have in the cloud, storage as a service, a lot of security as a service, etc. So instead of moving completely back on premises, move kind of somewhere in the middle while you're still leveraging and still close to the cloud in case you want to get back in. And they'll give you some self-service capabilities and so on and so forth. So if you haven't looked into cloud adjacency yet, I've got a ton of videos on YouTube, a lot of research papers on this topic where, yeah, we are definitely going to split the compute and the storage, folks. I know 15, 20 years ago, that was a big no-no. Today, absolutely, we can do it. There's no reason why you can't at least explore this option. Think differently, basically. Now, I told you earlier that you can get out of a cloud, right? You can. One more thing on cloud adjacency, what it gives you is predictable proximity, and it also gives you predictable performance. What that means is you always know what the proximity is to your colo facility, and you always know what that performance is, what that latency is. So that predictable capability that it gives you there is very important. Now we talked about, hey, lock-in is not inevitable. You can always get out of a lock-in. The only thing is, getting out of a lock-in is operationally challenging, it's time-consuming, and it's costly. It's going to, take you time to be able to get out of something, and it's going to take you a significant amount of effort to get out of something, and it's going to be costly because you are investing your time, potentially needing tools, potentially needing consultants, etc., to get out of something. So, do you want to avoid lock-in completely? There is a way to avoid lock-in completely. Don't leverage any of the cloud services. So don't use any PaaS services. Use only infrastructure, IaaS services. So basically virtual machines, containers, and data. Why? Well, because you could replicate those, and on a whim, you could just pick up everything and move it to another cloud provider. But then are you really going to the cloud? Because that's just another hosting facility. You could pretty much do that anywhere. You don't need the cloud to do that. You can go into a colo that has, a footprint worldwide, deploy VMware there and leverage containers and virtual machines, move your data. You're going to the cloud because of the PaaS services. Leverage the PaaS services. Don't be afraid to leverage the PaaS services. Do it in a methodical way. Do it for a reason. And don't be afraid of lock-in. Number 7, governance and management. That's a hurdle, but that's lower down the chain, right? But you absolutely want to be able to understand how you're going to govern this environment, right? How are you going to do that in an efficient way? How do you leverage landing zones, self-service capabilities? How are you going to automate your cloud enforcement policies, right? So are you going to allow folks to, for example, spin up instances, or are you going to require them to have a tag to spin up instances? Why have a tag? Because at the end of the month, now I can compartmentalize who's using these resources, and I can go do showbacks and chargebacks to them. So when someone says, hey, the IT budget is very high, no. Here's the breakdown of the bill. Here's who's using these resources. IT has nothing to do with it. The same thing for management. With management today, you have to be able to automate. You have to spend on automating the right things. You have to be able to monitor the right way. I had to put AI in here because although we haven't seen the impacts of AI to the extent that I'd like from a systems, from an operations perspective yet, it is inevitable that at some point AI is going to hopefully give us the capabilities, the ability to manage our cloud estates from a governance and management perspective in a smarter way, let's call it. So we keep an eye on AI and on some of the progress that's going to happen there as well. And then number 8 is data security and compliance. Now, I left security to the last, not because it's the least important. Security is the most important. But security is in everything. It's everywhere. It's kind of a default. You can't escape it, right? So is it a hurdle? Kind of, but it's not really a hurdle. You have to do it, whether you're on-prem, in the cloud, on the edge. It doesn't matter where you are today. You have to do security. And there's a lot of things that come up when it comes to security, whether it's regulations, whether it's data breaches, whether it's standardized security methods across multiple clouds, so that you're not having one security approach for AWS and another for Azure. Some kind of uniformity across all of them. Understanding the shared responsibility model, understanding identity and access management. How are you going to do that across multiple clouds, across not just clouds, across everything that you're going to do, SaaS, edge, all of the things that you're going to do. And then what is the role that AI is going to play in the near future, again, from a security perspective? Because I think governance, management, and security is where AI is really going to shine. Now, will AI be able to help us in assessing which application is a good candidate for the cloud? Maybe in time, maybe as the AI understands the environments and the hurdles and the requirements, maybe. But immediately, I think from a security, governance, and management perspective, AI will be able to help us significantly. So here, there's a lot of work to be done, but I think this work has to be done regardless of whether or not you're going to the cloud, or you're staying on-prem, or you're going to use the edge or not. Security is essentially front and center to everything that you're going to be doing in your digital world, so to speak. If you like this presentation, I have created an entire course on this topic, right? On how to develop the cloud strategy document, how to develop the application adoption, the cloud adoption framework, on how to develop the cloud implementation plans. I walk you through this step by step on how to do all of this. I give you the application assessment process to determine what goes to the cloud, what stays on premises, step by step. So there's a methodology there. So if you like this type, check out my course on Udemy. I have a YouTube channel where I publish also on a regular basis on these types of topics. Join there too. Take a look. Love to hear from you. Love to see your comments. And this brings us to the Q&A section. David, I am ready.
Yes, it does. And that's my department. And we've got a lot of questions in here. But first, I'd like to remind the audience that we can take questions up until about 5 minutes to the top of the hour in order to give you a short break before the next session. So please send them on in now. And let's get to the questions. We'll go first come, first serve, last, which means if you're following along in the console, I'll be reading the questions from the bottom up. So let's get started. How do we prepare our IT team and organization for the transition to cloud systems, cloud-based systems?
Can you read that one more time? How do you prepare IT what? I'm sorry?
How do we prepare our IT team and organization for the transition to cloud-based systems?
Yeah, great question. So this is, again, I will take you, I'm gonna hammer this cloud strategy thing just because I really believe in it. Convincing the IT team and preparing the IT team are two different things. Oftentimes what I found is preparing them is a matter of either sending them to the right training or hiring folks that have kind of done these types of cloud transformation projects before to help bring the rest of the team along. So you send them to training, you bring folks that have done this before, and the team kind of coalesces. You've got a specified leader that takes you in the right direction. That is from a preparation perspective. But there is sometimes resistance to cloud. Sometimes the team doesn't understand why you're using cloud. Sometimes they don't want to use cloud. Sometimes cloud is a threat. This is why it's important, when I mentioned earlier, to have a project or a cloud architect that's leading this effort, because identifying your business sponsor is going to be crucial. Once you've put together a cloud strategy document, once you've circulated this cloud strategy document amongst the team, you've gathered feedback from everyone, once everyone knows why we're going to the cloud and what is the business impact that going to the cloud is going to have, they will have no choice but to support this initiative. Why? Because again, it's not an IT initiative anymore. This is a business initiative. We're going to the cloud because we want to roll out in these regions. We don't have a footprint in these regions. The cloud's going to give us the ability to deploy very quickly in these regions. And as a result, we can start generating revenue in these regions. I'm making up an example. Now that we've said the why, right? And now that we've said, oh, and by the way, you know, so-and-so executive is bought into this. He or she is the person that is sponsoring this project and pushing it forward. The only thing left for the team is, okay, what do we need to do? That's where you come in and say, okay, I need you to go take these classes. That takes you back to that skills transparency list that I talked about. You publish the skills that you need and say, hey, if you want to be part of this, you want to be part of this organization for the next 5 years, these are the skills that you need to have. And as a result, they would need to go get these skills, get on board, back the project, bring you to the finish line. Sorry, long-winded answer, but that was a tough question a little bit.
Okay. Next question. How do we choose the right cloud service provider for our needs?
Yeah. A couple of different ways. So if you've got subscriptions to services from research companies, a lot of these research companies will have criteria that you can use in a spreadsheet to assess these different providers. Now, what at this point, like this was crucial, probably, I would say 7 or 8 years ago. Today, I would say, regardless of which cloud provider you're going to choose, you're probably not going to make, you're not going to make a mistake. But there are certain things that you will have to take into consideration. For example, if you tell me I need the highest level of availability, I really need high level of availability, I would say go with AWS. Why? Because every single one of their regions is architected with 3 availability zones and more. Their availability zones are at least a mile apart. They've got good separation in that. They are tested at scale, et cetera, et cetera. So if you highlight availability as a driver, I would say go with AWS. If you highlight hybrid as, you know, make it or break it, I would probably say go with Microsoft. Microsoft has designed everything around their hybrid capabilities. Every single piece of their software is hybrid. They've got Azure Stack. They've got a whole slew of things that support hybrid. So depending on what you're trying to accomplish, one cloud provider might be a little better than the others. But I would say at this point in the game, you probably won't go wrong with any of these cloud providers. But I'll take it one step further. You're going to use more than one. It's inevitable if you're not already using more than one.
Okay. Next question. What are the cost implications of cloud migration, and how can we manage these costs effectively? Sounds like you do a whole presentation on that.
Oh, yes, we can certainly do a whole presentation on that. So this I'm going to answer like I was taught to answer by saying it depends. um, this is going to depend again on how you're moving the application, right? Is it a lift and shift? Are you moving to SaaS? Are you moving? Are you going to revise the application, re-architect the whole thing? Do you have the right skills? Do you have the right tools? Um, it really depends. So that I'm going to have to say, if you give me a little more detail, I'll be able to give you a little more, but it'll depend on a lot of the things that you're working through.
That makes sense. Let's try to squeeze through 2 or 3 more questions. Let's get started right now. How can we minimize downtime and disruptions to our business operations during the migration process?
Yeah. So so that's a good question also. So what I would say is, once you've decided which applications are migrating to the cloud, you probably want to deploy a proof of concept of these applications on the cloud provider that you're choosing to deploy it on. So it doesn't have to be the same, it doesn't have to be at the same scale that the production application is being deployed, but you want to deploy some kind of a proof of concept at a smaller level. Bring your power users, those users that you know are the ones you're going to rely on, have them test the environment, give you some feedback on what are they experiencing, what are some of the challenges, et cetera, et cetera. The second layer would probably be to do some kind of a stress test on it on one of the days where you decide, hey, we're going to stress test the application, and then you start to roll it out. But you definitely don't want to do an on-off switch type of scenario where today, on Friday you're on premises, come Monday everybody's on the cloud. That's just, you're pretty much asking for trouble.
All right. Directly to the next question. How do we handle the migration of legacy systems and applications to the cloud? That's another one that sounds like a seminar topic.
Oh, yes. We should definitely do another summit on that. What I will tell you is, don't be afraid of lift and shift. I've talked to a lot of customers that make it a point, we are not going to do lift and shift. In my experience, it is impossible to avoid some level of lift and shift. So when it comes to legacy applications, there are a couple of different ways to address it. Either you do a lift and shift if the workload's already virtualized, or you keep it on premises. There's connectivity. There's no reason, unless you're getting rid of your on-premises environment completely. Or you do what I like to do a lot, which is to leverage cloud adjacency. So although it cannot be moved into the cloud, it can be brought within closer proximity to the cloud. As a result, maybe today it's legacy, maybe today it cannot be moved, tomorrow it probably will. So when we say legacy, then my initial question would be, like, what kind of legacy? Are you talking about a mainframe? If it is a mainframe, again, unless you tell me, hey, we're going to migrate, we're going to break it down and we're going to move it to Linux. And I've been hearing that for the last 15 years. No, you're probably not. Or if you do, you're moving some of its components, but you're not getting rid of the mainframe anytime soon. So if we agree we're not getting rid of the mainframe anytime soon, I would move it closer to the cloud. Cloud adjacency, cloud adjacency, cloud adjacency. Same thing for Unix. Unix, actually, a lot of customers have had success migrating to Linux. So that's an option. Once it's on Linux, then you could leverage VMs, etc. But again, if you still have instances where it's going to stay on Unix for a while, then move it closer to the cloud and keep it adjacent. So there's a lot of different ways of rethinking the environment, re-architecting the environment, where you get the best of both worlds. And the answer is not always move it to the cloud. It could be move it closer to the cloud.
Okay, looks like we have time for one more question. So squeeze this one in, Elias. What are the key considerations for selecting the right cloud service provider for a migration project?
So it probably, so I would say skills. My initial reaction to this would probably be skills. Do a gap analysis, a gap assessment of the types of skills that you have. If you already have a lot of folks that are, familiar with AWS, maybe that should be you should consider that. The other thing would probably be how much benefit are you getting from a cost perspective with some of these cloud providers? So you might have a lot of skill sets with AWS, but here comes Microsoft giving you an enterprise agreement with significant and steep discounts. At that point, you would have to take a look and say, okay, I can retrain these folks, but I'm getting some steep discounts here. Better yet, maybe you're looking at Google. Google says, you know what, we are going to invest in you. So not only are we going to give you discounts, we're also going to give you the resources that you need to help you through this migration. Now they've sweetened the pot. So there's a lot of these considerations that are not just technical in nature that would help you decide which cloud provider you should choose. But again, I will reiterate, for the most part, these hyperscalers are, I don't want to say they're at the same level. There are still differences. AWS is still ahead in a lot of areas. Microsoft is a really good close second. Google is a really good close third, and they're closing the gap. So you're not going to go wrong with any of them, and you're probably going to use more than one. But there are still some considerations, and you still have to do some homework.
All right, great answer. It looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Elias, for answering all those questions and a great presentation.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you, David, for your moderation, and thank you, everyone, for giving me the opportunity.